Hi all, my name is Scott Lenski. I'm one of the librarians here at the Whitefish Bay Public Library. I'm happy you could join us for this talk with author and historian Tom Fehring. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention that the library has a new newsletter. You can choose which news you'd like to hear based on your interests. We know you get a lot of email in your inbox, and we want you to just hear the news you'd like from the library. So you can choose your preferences for your newsletter on our website. I'll drop a link to that in the chat in a little bit. Now on to Tom. Tom Fehring is a local author and historian with a background in mechanical engineering. He worked for 35 years at the Wisconsin Energy Corporation. And previous to that, he worked with the Falk Corporation, Briggs and Stratton, and the Ford Motor Company. Tom, he's a resident of Whitefish Bay and has been very involved with the Whitefish Bay Historical Society. He's also a member of the Whitefish Bay Historic Preservation Commission, which is charged with the responsibility of assisting in the preservation of the village's historic and cultural heritage. There's more information about that commission online. Tom wrote the books literally on Whitefish Bay. I've got two of them here, which we have in our library for checkout. He is also the author of The Magnificent Machines of Milwaukee, which tells the story of innovation and enterprise creation in Milwaukee during the 100 years starting after the conclusion of the Civil War. His newest book, which he'll be talking about this evening, is called When Milwaukee Went to War. The presentation is going to be about 45 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time at the end. We're going to just try and go for an hour tonight with some questions. So if you have questions, you can drop them in the chat, and we'll try and answer them at the end of the talk. So I'm going to hand it off to Tom.
Okay, well, thanks, Scott. Thanks for the introduction. Kind of an interesting time to come out with a book during the midst of the pandemic, because I typically, the other books that I've published, I've usually gone around to local clubs and the like and given presentations on the book. But all of that, of course, has been pretty much off the table. So I have been making some virtual presentations like this one. They're always a little bit awkward. I always hope the technology is working well. If anybody has trouble hearing or has trouble seeing the presentations and stuff, speak up certainly. I see the if you're not familiar with the Zoom settings and everything, on the bottom of your screen you should have a chat button you can click, and you can ask any questions along the way, and certainly encourage you to do that. And with that, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to bring up my presentation and see if we can get started. Okay, so now I've got the presentation on the screen. I can no longer see anybody, but my hope is everybody can see that on the page. Scott, can you confirm?
I cannot. I can see you still. I cannot see your presentation.
Okay.
You want to try it again here?
Yeah, let me. Screen sharing has failed to start. The window you selected is invalid. I'm going to close this and start it again. Okay, sorry for that interruption. Okay, well, this here I'm going to see if I can also minimize the I apologize, I'm playing around a little bit to get people off the screen so I can see actually what I'm talking from. Okay, so when Milwaukee went to war, the background on this, Scott had mentioned that a few years ago I published a book called The Magnificent Machines of Milwaukee. And about a year and a half ago, the Groman Museum in Milwaukee, they're on the campus of the Milwaukee School of Engineering, they decided to hold an exhibit based upon this book. And they asked if I would help curate the exhibit. So I did that. It was a lot of fun. The exhibit ran for about 6-7 months. They actually extended it because it was well received, got some pretty good publicity on it. And it was a lot of fun getting some of the artifacts, because we went around to a lot of the old line Milwaukee manufacturers and asked if we could exhibit a lot of their archival machinery and stuff. one of the persons that attended that exhibit was a guy named Dan Buttery. Dan is the president CEO of the Milwaukee War Memorial, and he had been looking for a way to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the conclusion of the Second World War. And when that exhibit at the Groman Museum ended, he approached me and asked if I would help him curate an exhibit that would be held at the Milwaukee War Memorial Center, which indeed did occur. And again, I started that process kind of the same way. We went around to a number of Milwaukee companies that had been involved in the World War II effort, and we obtained their approval to showcase some of the items that were manufactured in Milwaukee during the Second World War. And then, during the midst of all that, the pandemic really hit and became, more pronounced. It obviously affected attendance, and I suggested that, well, maybe I could start writing articles for their monthly newsletter. And I started doing that, and after about the 5th or 6th article, I suggested, well, maybe, again, there's going to be a lot of people that would have loved to have attended the exhibit, were not able to do that. Maybe we can put that that all in the form of a book. So that kind of led to the publication of this book. It was put together rather hurriedly, but and it borrowed some of the information that had previously been published in the Magnificent Machines of Milwaukee. But then it went beyond that, because as I started digging into some of the activities that occurred in Milwaukee, I found a lot of information that I previously hadn't been aware of. So that's kind of a background for all of this. This preliminary slide is taken at A.O. Smith. Those are big bomb casings, as I think is probably evident. A.O. Smith's, one of their expertises, as you'll see in a few minutes, was welding. And they were probably the foremost company in the world to use advanced welding concepts. And they were called upon to make, the principal manufacturer of large bombs like the ones shown here came out of A.O. Smith, as well as things like propellers and the like. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So let's kind of launch into this. I thought it'd be helpful to talk about some of the key dates. I had mentioned earlier that, late last year was the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. The date that most historians point to as the start of the Second World War was the date when Germany invaded Poland, September 1st of 1939. The United States didn't get involved directly in the war until a little over 2 years later, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered the war at that time. Hitler then declared war on the United States. And, largely the Allies were in a defensive mode for a good portion of that time, starting, however, in 1944 with the Normandy invasion. That began to turn quite significantly. And certainly then with the Battle of the Bulge, where we were beginning to take the war to Germany in 1944, you could kind of see that things were coming to an end. Germany surrendered in May 7th of 1945. And then the formal Japanese surrender was September 2nd, 1945. So a 6-year period of time. The United States direct involvement was about 4 years, but even before those 4 years, the United States was supplying material for the Allies in the war effort, even though I think largely we're claiming to be neutral. But the key dates, I thought it'd be helpful. And quotes. This quote by Franklin Roosevelt in 1943 says, "Every combat division, every naval task force, every squadron of fighting planes is dependent for its equipment and ammunition and fuel and food on the American people in civilian clothes." And then a similar one, John Ward wrote a book called The Little Ships That Could, and he said the battles of World War II were won as much on the assembly line as on the firing line. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all the Allied military equipment produced during the war. Without that involvement, the Second World War would have not ended the way it did. And then if you look at, some of the items, just a few of the items that were built, almost 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million Army trucks, quite a number of trucks that were built right here in Milwaukee, 80,000 landing craft, and Falk Corporation made some of the major components for the landing craft. Merchant ships, 5,600, 1,500 naval ships, Milwaukee, Ellis Chambers and other companies, Filer and Stoll, provided turbines and steam engines and the like to power those ships. And A.O. Smith provided the welding expertise into a lot of that. 20 million small arms, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, some of which were produced by the Badger facility right located on Port Washington Road, just south of Hampton. Actually, the buildings still stand. They're immediately south of what is now, I believe, the Hilton Hotel, the Anchorage restaurant Hilton Hotel. Just south of that area is a number of red brick buildings that used to be the Badger Ordnance Plant, and a lot of the ammunition was made right there. 6 million tons of bombs, and I showed you some of the bombs that A.O. Smith made earlier in the war. So the United States was largely principally involved in providing the equipment, the military equipment for the Allies, and Milwaukee was a key player in that. Certainly, one of the top 6 or 7 cities, because Milwaukee was a major industrial center. I've just got a few slides of this exhibit that occurred between August 1st and December 30th at the Milwaukee's War Memorial Center. Just to show some of the things, a couple of Harley-Davidson motorbikes were on display. We had cases that displayed information from the various companies. For example, this is an engine used for drones during the Second World War, made by Falk Corporation, which is now Milwaukee Mercury Outboard. All of the columns were covered with display material. This is just one of them. A lot of work went into that. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, not as many people attended the exhibit as we would have liked, which was obviously a little disappointing. But my hope is that the book itself kind of complements that narrative. So the book came out to complement the war. I'm going to be principally talking about the involvement of Milwaukeeans at the home front and the sacrifices they made during the course of the war effort. The book covers contributions of 30-some Milwaukee area companies. I'm just going to focus on a few of those. If you want more information, read the book. And Scott's got the book on the shelves at the Whitefish Bay Library, and the book is also readily available for sale. I'm going to start with A.O. Smith because its involvement in the war effort was very, very key and very early in the process. My understanding is that much of the oil, oil, of course, and fuel for aircraft and for naval ships and the trucks and the like was very, very critical to the war effort. And much of that fuel came from the United States, probably the preponderance of that fuel. And of course, the fuel had to be refined. And what was occurring is the oil was being drilled in Texas and the Gulf Coast, and then being taken by tanker to the refineries on the East Coast. And of course, the Germans knew that, so the Germans began sinking those transport vessels. And there were well over 100 vessels that were sunk in a fairly short period of time. Something needed to be done very, very critically, and a decision was made to construct pipelines to carry that oil from the Gulf Coast areas to to the eastern refineries. And A.O. Smith was one of the principal companies that provided the piping for that line, and Ellis Chalmers provided all of the pumps that were used on the line. You can see there are actually two lines. There was a 24-inch line, which is shown in green here, the big inch line, and then the little big inch, I believe is a 20-inch line, is shown here in yellow. All of the pumping stations are the black dots, and then the rectangles are where tank farms were located. But again, A.O. Smith was called upon to make much of the pipe for the project. I've got what I think is a very interesting video. This takes a little bit, I think it's about 7 minutes or so. But if the technology works, this shows the inside of the factory. It shows how that piping was fabricated. And to me, the first time I saw it, my jaw dropped, because I had no idea exactly how that piping was created. So I'm going to start that. And Scott, let me know if the volume doesn't work on this.
Yes, it's line pipe. Rugged, capable, welded pipe made by the exclusive Smithway process. One small part in the thousands of miles of steel arteries that mean so much to our way of life. The scalp moves toward another gigantic machine to begin the shaping into pipe. That press you see in the distance is one of 3 hydraulic monsters designed and built by the A.O. Smith Corporation to do this shaping. The scalp will be shaped into a broad letter U, the first of 3 steps.
Oops. Mighty hydraulic jaws will bend the steel to pear shape in section. Comes the closing operation. A squeeze of 11,000 tons is used to produce this tubular shape. The time has come to unite the abutting edges with a weld that's as strong as the steel itself. First, a locating lug is welded to each end of the tube. Then it enters one of the million-dollar machines that welds the 40-foot length in a few seconds. A
water-cooled arbor inside the pipe will expand and clamp the two edges against electrical contacts. A 1,000,000-ampere arc surges across the line of contact, heating the 40-foot edges until the steel becomes semi-liquid. Just after the current is cut off, the edges are bumped together by the hydraulic mechanism. This makes the weld and squeezes out the oxides formed by the heating. The result is a clean, sound, strong union of the abutting edges. Entering one of the huge internal sizing machines, the pipe will be expanded by water pressure. This expansion makes the pipe round, straight, and of the correct diameter. Under that terrific pressure, the circumference of the pipe is stretched beyond the yield point of the steel. Besides proving the soundness of the weld, this operation raises the yield point value of the steel in the pipe. Final end facing is the only remaining manufacturing operation. And now our pipe is finished except for the testing and inspection. In this machine, the pipe will be stressed to 80 or 90% of its yield strength as specified. And then, with the pipe under full pressure, a series of 6.5-pound hammers strike repeated blows on the weld to test its resistance to shock. The entire length of the weld is inspected to make sure there are no leaks. And there goes another load of Smithway line pipe, service-proved, light in weight for its strength, uniform and accurate in quality and dimensions. More pipe for the thousands of miles of steel arteries that carry the lifeblood of our nation.
Well, I apologize. The video was a little choppy. The entire video was about 30 minutes in length, and I just wanted to pull out some critical parts of all of that. A.O. Smith, of course, was well known for automation. They were building truck auto frames since the 20s, 1923 or so, with an almost entirely automated power plant or automated manufacturing facility. And that plus their welding expertise really is what made their involvement so critical to the war effort. They also used their techniques to produce casing for large bombs, and you can see that here. They produced 4.5 million large bomb casings and 47,000 steel propeller blades. And then they provided guidance on welding techniques for the Liberty ship program. Before that, ships were largely assembled through welding, through a riveting technique, which would have taken much longer. But because of the guidance that A.O. Smith was able to provide, as well as the expertise, A.O. Smith had developed coated welding rods that did not use asbestos and were produced locally with local products and the like. And because of having that expertise and guiding the companies that were producing the ships in that process, we were very successful in decreasing the amount of time required for ship production during the course of the war. Let's move on to Ellis-Chalmers. They were the largest employer in the Milwaukee area. They were called upon to play a significant role in providing steam turbines for numerous of the warships. You can see the cover picture from the photograph shows some steam turbines being bladed in Ellis-Chalmers facilities. They also provided condensers. All the steam that passes through the steam turbines has to be condensed and then reheated, reboiled, and then made into steam again to keep that process going. They provided the condensers for much of the process. And then they were called upon to produce a factory to build turbo superchargers. All of during the Second World War, the war, of course, from a aircraft standpoint was fought with rotary engines, with propellers, and they wanted to fly the aircraft at high elevations so that they would not be as subject to destruction by enemy ground forces and the like. So they wanted to fly at very high altitudes, but when you fly at very high altitudes, a regular internal combustion engine cannot breathe enough for combustion and to provide adequate power. So in order to do that, the fuel air mixture had to be supercharged. And Ellis-Chalmers made the lion's share of the superchargers that were used. This is a kind of a cutaway view. You can see the exhaust port. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but if you can see this red disc, so the exhaust from the internal combustion aircraft engine would pass through the blading on the red turbine. That red turbine, of course, would then spin this compressor on the top, the blue compressor. The blue compressor, of course, then provided the raw air that was coming into the engine. Fuel is added, and because of that, then the aircraft were able to fly at very high altitudes. Ellis-Chalmers built 100,000 of those, totaling 16 million horsepower, and that facility was staffed almost entirely by women. I believe I've got some photographs of that later on in the presentation. Very key to the war effort, Ellis-Chalmers produced the magnetic coils for the enrichment of uranium for the Manhattan Project, as well as other equipment. This is just a little detail here. You can see a coil here is actually being wound. I'm going to go to the next slide. You can see the same detail in the center here, center upper portion of the photograph. There's a lot going on in this photograph. I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes here. You can see that metal is being wound around this electromagnet. The material is actually silver. There was an insufficient amount of copper for this project, and the military approached the Department of Treasury. The Department of Treasury allowed silver bullion to be used, had to be melted, and then of course pounded and the like to develop these long silver strips. And you can see the strips are being unwound from a coil at the far left end of the photograph. If you look just to the right of that, there's a desk and there's a clerk there. It looks like there's a woman clerk. There were accountants assigned to this project because the silver, of course, was so valuable. They had accountants to keep track of all of the silver that was employed in the process to make sure that it was all being used or the scrap was all being collected. And I believe that one of the things that we're doing, and this coil, this decoil here, would ultimately go inside this structural shape, which you see is underneath this machine. I think this machine is after that shape has been assembled, I believe this machine was essentially to make sure that all the surfaces were flush, and then they could be mated to other ones. And just look at the shape of this a little bit. You see these reinforcing structures on either side. The next photograph, you'll see how those were actually deployed. Another thing I want to point out is there's a wooden wall separating the assembly area on the top left right of the top right of the photograph from the subassembly portions, and that was largely done for security. Ellis Chalmers was told by the military you had to keep this operation as secretive as possible. We don't want word to get out about what we're doing here. So that in order to do that and to try to provide some security in the process, they put up the wall so that the employees on one side really couldn't see the finished product. Even if they could see the finished product, it probably would have been very difficult to understand what it was. They would certainly have known that it was some sort of magnetic coil, would not have known certainly what it was being used for. Signage was provided around the facility, as well as certainly other military industrial facilities, letting people know that part of the job is to hold your tongue. Silence is very, very important. This is one of the calderons that those coils were used. You can see, remember I suggested that you look at this casing and the reinforcing strips around that. I believe that Ellis Chalmers produced 600 rather of these coils. And this is just one of the calderons that was used for the enrichment of uranium. The uranium, was oxidized and was passing around the raceway with inside those decoils, and the heavier portion of the uranium would probably go to the outside and the lighter portions to the inside. So that was one of the processes used to separate the and further refine the uranium. Ellis Chalmers also provided over 6,000 pumps for the gaseous diffusion process. In order to get the refinement necessary to create an atomic bomb, uranium had to be refined to very, very high purity. Typically in a power plant, you maybe can get away with 10% or something. And for atomic bombs, I believe you need to enrich it to about 90%. So they actually went through 3 different refinement processes, one of which was this gaseous diffusion process. The military had actually approached a number of pump manufacturers and asked them to create these pumps, and all of them declined to do it other than Ellis Chalmers. And the problem was the seals. The material, the uranium that's inside these gaseous diffusion pumps is about 12 times the weight of, 12 times heavier than what oxygen would be in that same process. And it's a very destructive process, and most seals would deteriorate very readily in that, and the other manufacturers didn't think seals would hold up. Fortunately, right around that period of time, somebody had developed Teflon, and the seals were actually produced out of solid blocks of Teflon that proved to be very, very satisfactory in the process. This is just the gaseous diffusion plant in Oak Ridge was the world's largest building because they just had so many of these gaseous diffusion pumps as well as filters. Each of these pumps was coupled to a filter, as you can see by this diagram. The filters were used to separate the heavier elements from the lighter elements, and is part of the overall refining process. And this proved to be a very, very successful refining process. And in fact, I won't say too much more about that. But Ellis-Schellenberg provided the more material by volume and by weight than any other manufacturer to that process. I'm going to move on to a different area because I think, well, we got to keep moving along. Milwaukee was also involved in producing bomb fuses. You know, all bombs need a fuse in order for them to explode. Badger Meter, Briggs and Stratton, Evernood, Globe Union were all involved in producing fuses to detonate military bombs. And as the war progressed, the fuses became increasingly sophisticated. It's not well known, but the United States had developed proximity fuses. All of the major forces in the war were attempting to develop proximity fuses. The way these things work is they'd send out a radar signal, and when that signal would bounce off of the structure that you're trying to eliminate, maybe it's an aircraft, maybe it's a tank, maybe it's the ground, then that proximity fuse would, that radar signal would bounce back, it would be detected, and then at the appropriate time, the bomb would be, the fuse would cause the bomb to explode. It was a very, very highly classified secret for the early parts of the war. The military did not permit any of these proximity fuses to be used over ground because they wanted to make sure that, an unexploded ordnance was not able to be captured by the military or by the enemy and then taken apart to find out what this technology was. In the latter portions of the war, certainly the Battle of the Bulge, the proximity fuses had become smaller and smaller, small enough that they could be mounted on the head of mortar shells. And all of the fuses used for that purpose were made here in Milwaukee by Central Lab, located in what is now the River West neighborhood. Central Lab, had developed technology to minimize the size of these. They were using what today we'd call a circuit board. At that time, they called it a thick film hybrid circuit. It was like a glass type board, if you will, that was drilled and resistors would be mounted, or they would actually be located right into the wiring. The wiring was printed onto the board, similar to the technology that we're all familiar with today. They were able to get the size of the circuit down to 1.25 inches by 1.75 inches. So very, very small. And it had to be very, very rugged because this is being fired from, from a mortar, with huge forces and the like. And of course, very, very secretive in that whole process. And this is, of all of the secrets that could have been damaging to the forces during the course of the war, this is one of the best, and word largely didn't get out. I've got another short video on this, and this one's much shorter and a bit cruder. You'll see a number of proximity fuses on this first screen here. I believe the fuse in the lower right corner is the fuse that was manufactured for mortar shells by Central Lab. And just to kind of further explain how important these proximity fuses are, I'm going to play this video.
The major advancement in ordnance to emerge from World War II is the VT, or proximity fuse. A top secret project during the war, the details of construction and operation are still a secret. Some of its unique properties, however, may now be described.
about suicide pilots. These special diagrams tell the story better than words. First, an ordinary bomb exploding on contact. We've no doubt about the success of this deadly invention. Plenty of con.
All right. Well,
Major advancements in art.
again, that was a little choppy, but it was, it proved to be a very, very effective tool, not only for, protecting our warships from military, the enemy aircraft, but also very, very effective. And when it became used in the Battle of the Bulge, the German soldiers that were trying to defend that area, they just did not know how, that there was no place they could hide really, because these proximity fuses, if they went off any place in the area, the shrapnel from the bombs would, just tear through just about anything. So it was a very, very critical element. And again, Milwaukee Central Lab facility, which is for a long period of time was part of Johnson Controls. And it was produced right here. I'm going to talk one other company because time is limited, but Cutler Hammer, since 1908, produced almost all of the controls used by the Navy. And they also provided controls for other branches of the military, including aircraft. You can see the B-29 alone had 70 Cutler Hammer switches located within it, all manufactured here in Milwaukee. When it came to providing controls for the large naval ships and submarine warfare, which was really, Second World War was really the first time submarine warfare was really a critical element in it. They found out that that the controls were causing problems under battle conditions. A close hit would provide enough impact that the controls could be jarred from one position to another, and you can't have that on a ship. To have things that are supposed to be on jarred off, or even worse, have something that's supposed to be off and turned into the on position because of that impact could cause disastrous effects. And Cutler Hammer was tasked with redesigning motor controls to eliminate that product. They were quite successful, and because of that success, from that point going forward, Cutler Hammer and what is now today's DRS Technologies, they spun that division off. But DRS Technologies is located in here in Milwaukee, and they make the controls for Navy ships, which is getting increasingly complex because of all of the, controls. Just is becoming a more and more important facet of warcraft, if you will. And again, that's all produced here in Milwaukee. Other companies located in the book, I'm just going to let them flash up here on the screen. A lot of materials produced here. I'm going to go now, moving beyond what individual companies did. I want to talk a little bit about the Army Navy Excellence in Production Awards. The Army Navy, in order to encourage and to help support the companies that were good at this, they came out with an Army Navy Excellence Award called an E Award, largely, that would measure, the quality and the quantity of production and overcoming obstacles in production and the like. And it was only granted to about 5% of U.S. manufacturers. There were 68 Milwaukee area firms, however, that were granted a total of 268 awards. And the way these awards worked, if you won the award once, you were eligible for it in subsequent years so that you could receive an additional star to signify that you continue to get the award. The award was always presented as a banner, typically an official ceremony held in which the military, typically representatives from the Army and the Navy, would be there and meet with employees and company officials, and in which the award was given, the flag would be raised. In some cases, individual employees got pins to signify their awards. This award here is at the A.J. Speaker facility. They made raincoats for the military, and I believe the woman pictured here was, one of the employees that was selected off the assembly line to be present on the stage just on behalf of the employees. And you can see people from the military as well as the president of the company in receiving these awards. This is a celebration at Harley Davidson. You can see they've got, the award plus a star. So this was, essentially they would have received the award twice. I think they ultimately received the award 4 times for its efforts. And of course, many employees received these, E awards, individual awards meant to be worn on a lapel or whatever. So if any of you, have gone through your parents' belongings, your grandparents' belongings, and you came across one of these, that's what that was all about. Also, there was a great amount of effort during the course of the war to promote the activities that people were doing on the home front. If you look at some of these posters, do the job he left behind. There were a lot of women that were involved in the war effort. I believe about 25% or more of the employees, in the production facilities were women, and were very, very critical to the production of military equipment. This is a photograph from that Ellis Chalmers supercharger plant. You can see, and there's a dozen or more photographs from that plant, and almost all of women that were working to manufacture and assemble those. And this is another photograph of a lathe operator that was working in the Ellis Chalmers supercharger plant right off of Holly Road in West Ellis. There was also, this Second World War was the first time in which women were pulled into the workforce, in which African Americans were pulled into the workforce. And in both cases, there was some discord, of course, that had occurred. The country really was not used to diversification, certainly in factories. Factories were largely a male dominion, if you will. And because of some of the strife that occurred, there were efforts like this Double V Award that would recognize, that we're protecting democracy at home and abroad. We're looking for victory in both cases. Let's emphasize the importance of accepting that diversity and working with one another in the country's contribution to the war effort. When the war finally ended, Milwaukee, like a lot of cities, really celebrated. Certainly when Germany surrendered first, there was a muted celebration because a lot of our men were still in harm's way in the Pacific. But then when the Japanese surrendered, I'm told that without a call for people to congregate, that when the word came out that the Japanese having surrendered, people just went downtown, and they just, this is Wisconsin Avenue. They just ended up there. They needed to be outside. They needed to be there to celebrate. They needed to if you look, there's a number of girls in the middle here that are dancing. This was obviously a joyous time. This is another photograph right outside of what had been Gimbel's. And of course, after the war, there were numerous events held to commemorate those that have worked those that fought in the war, as well as those that had died in the war. This photograph here on the left here was taken in Whitefish Bay at Big Bay Park. There used to be a large banner with the names of those that had been in the Second World War, as well as those that had died during the course of the Second World War. I believe that eagle that's on top of there is currently in the Whitefish Bay Historical Files down in the basement of the Whitefish Bay Library. And at some point, we got to figure out what to do with that, because that was an important part of the memorial. So this, I'm going to close at this point. The book is available. You can see it for sale. It's largely $15 at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, Historic Milwaukee, Boswell Books, all in this area. And of course, it's available on Amazon. And the proceeds are all donated to the Milwaukee War Memorial Center. And if you want to look beyond that, and you haven't seen it, this is the Magnificent Machines of Milwaukee. And it's got over 300 pictures and other illustrations, and goes into a lot of depth about Milwaukee manufacturing base and the history of technology in the Milwaukee area. And of course, both books are available on the shelves of the Whitefish Bay Library. So, Scott, do we have any questions or comments?
Does anyone have any questions? If you have questions, you can drop them right in the chat. Or if you want to turn your mic on, fine. That's fine as well. I
do recognize I ran over a little bit. I was going to try to keep this to 45 minutes. And
you got very close, very close. So, so we have a question from Nancy asking about the Falk Corporation, their involvement. Do you want to add? Can you say anything about that?
Yeah. In fact, there is a section in the book on the Falk Corporation. They made a lot of the gearing that was required. When all of the battleships during the course of the war, at least the ones that were produced, were manufactured for the war effort themselves, used steam turbines. And steam turbines operate at a very high rotating speed, 1,200 RPM, 16, 18, 3,600 RPM. And that speed had to be dropped significantly down to propeller speed. And of course, you needed gearing for that. And Falk made a lot of the gearing that was used for taking the steam turbine output and using it in warships. They also made the clutches that were used, reversible clutches, that were used for the landing vehicles. The military, of course, they knew well before the Normandy invasion that they needed to have a craft that would run up on the shore at high speed, drop off the men and machinery and the like, and then be able to reverse off of the beach using a lot of power. So they had very powerful engines, but they needed a reversing clutch that would allow them to power on very quickly, flip a switch, and then power right off very quickly. And Falk made all of those reversing clutches, and a lot of engineering went into that overall process. So Falk was very, very critical to the war effort.
Someone's asking, Paul's asking if the pay for women factory workers was the same as men's.
Yeah, it generally was not. And I believe that not only were women discriminated against during the course of the war, but also African Americans were discriminated against. And not only in pay, sometimes in housing conditions. For example, in Waukesha Motors made diesels for the course of the war, and in order to provide housing for the employees that worked in the facility, there was a housing project built adjacent to that, and of course, the whites got the better housing, the African Americans did not. And that certainly caused some of the discord. On the other hand, this was the first time that for both women and African Americans that they were able to work in the factories and at relatively good paying jobs. And, so that, both good and bad came out of this. It certainly, if it wasn't for the Second World War, it would have taken much, much, much longer to integrate the factories, not only in Milwaukee, but across the United States.
Any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat. Well, thank you everyone for coming this evening. We did record the presentation, and then that will be available through our Facebook page and our website probably sometime next week. We'll get that up. Someone's asking if the library is open. We are open right now. Our hours are 10 to 7 p.m. Monday through Thursday, 10 to 4 Friday and Saturday, and noon to 4 on Sunday. And everyone's saying thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and have a great night, everyone.
Okay. Well, thanks, Philip. Certainly appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Couldn't say thank you. Thanks, Tom.